Does the First Minister agree with Pete Wishart, currently the SNP's longest-serving MP at Westminster, who said earlier on this week it was a fair point that her government had imposed too many COVID restrictions over Christmas?
First Minister.
I'm not sure that is a fair representation of Pete Wishart's comments. But can I first take the opportunity, Presiding Officer, to recognise that Pete Wishart is, I think, Scotland's longest-serving Member of Parliament, which I think goes to show what an outstanding service Pete Wishart does for his constituents. And let me take the opportunity, and I'm sure Douglas Ross will join me in paying tribute to his public service. I think we introduced a series of balanced protective measures over the Christmas period, coupled with the extraordinary response of the public, changing their behaviour, and of course the extraordinary success of the booster programme. We are thankfully now in a better position than we might have been when we were looking ahead before the Christmas period. But we're not in a position that I think allows us any complacency. COVID rates are still high. There are still significant uncertainties ahead, which is why I think doctors, nurses, NHS managers, trade unions all expressed some concern with the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday to lift all restrictions at this stage, including the requirement to wear face coverings. So we will continue to take a proportionate and balanced set of decisions to try to get through this next, I hope, final phase of the pandemic and keep the country as safe as we possibly can do while we're doing so.
Douglas Ross.
The First Minister said it wasn't a fair representation of Pete Wishart's comments. It was a direct quote. He was asked, has the First Minister in Scotland introduced too many COVID restrictions over Christmas? And his response was, that is a fair point. He agreed with the premise of the question. And the First Minister went on to laud his parliamentary career. Perhaps you could maybe listen to him when he, an SNP member, elected representative, is saying the restrictions imposed over Christmas were too much. Because the First Minister imposed restrictions that had a massive impact on jobs, on businesses, on people's mental and physical health. But we can now see they weren't needed. It was the Scottish public's actions, not the SNP government's restrictions, that got this right. The First Minister has tried to build a reputation for caution during this pandemic, but she was far too gung-ho in imposing extra restrictions last month. Will she now accept that her government went too far?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, the public did comply. They complied with what the government asked them to do. I think Douglas Ross is striking rather a desperate note right now, just as if he is seriously describing Pete Wishart, showing, as all elected representatives should, some respect for the point somebody was making to him, as evidence that Pete Wishart agrees with Douglas Ross rather than with this government, then all that says to people is that Douglas Ross is showing rather more political desperation right now than we even thought he might have been. We've taken a balanced approach. Let me just say what I think. At the moment, this cautious approach is the one that we should be taking. That's my sentiments. Those are not actually my words, though. Those are the words of Sandesh Gohani, MSP, on BBC Scotland on the 7th of January. So if Douglas Ross is basing his entire line of questioning to me right now on something Pete Wishart said, then what is his response to his own MSP, saying that the cautious approach is the one that we should be taking? But then we've got Professor Susan Meeke, a member of the UK Government SAGE Committee. Scotland is doing something that is very good from a public health point of view. And of course, the Scottish approach is in line with the Welsh Government's approach and the Northern Irish Government's approach. We're taking a sensible approach through this, which is why infection levels, although dropping now thankfully in all parts of the UK, are lower in Scotland than they are in England right now, and over the festive period the numbers of people in hospital proportionately were lower. So we are not out of the woods yet, although things look far more positive, but I'm going to continue to take a cautious approach because, frankly, the price of throwing caution to the wind is not paid by governments. The price of throwing caution to the wind is paid by people across the country in terms of ill health and, sadly, in some cases, serious illness and death. And that's a price I don't think I should impose on the people of Scotland.
Douglas Ross.
First Minister, serious illness and death doesn't just come from COVID. It comes from restrictions being put in place that have a massive impact on people's mental health, on their physical health. We have been living with this pandemic now for 2 years, and I think the First Minister would do better to respond to the points being made. She may not like them, but the points and questions being made, rather than launching personal attacks on the opposition politicians who do it. Because not only did the First Minister impose unnecessary restrictions, she actually wanted to go further. The First Minister repeatedly claimed throughout December that the UK Government was holding her back from putting Scotland into lockdown again. She wanted to close down the economy, no matter the impact that would have on Scottish jobs and businesses. But the First Minister promised compensation when her restrictions were introduced. Yet now we're coming out of the restrictions, that compensation still hasn't been delivered to many businesses. They've not received a single penny. This week, the Federation of Small Businesses said, and I quote, "Thousands of Scottish businesses needlessly go under every year because of late payment." Will the First Minister accept that her government is currently the worst offender of late payments in Scotland?
First Minister.
No, but can I say to Douglas Ross, the pandemic is causing the serious impact on individuals and businesses across Scotland, the UK, Europe and the entire world. Much as we might all like to be able to do so, and believe me, I would love to be able to do so, we can't just magic it away. No country is able to do that. And I have to say to Douglas Ross, he has stood in his position in this chamber at every key juncture in the management of this pandemic since he's been back in this chamber, and he's opposed the decisions the Scottish Government has taken, even at times when there were exactly the same decisions that were being taken by his colleagues in the Westminster Government. He has decided to take an entirely opportunistic approach to the handling of a global pandemic. And I think people will judge that, and I don't think they will judge it very kindly. If we had listened to Douglas Ross, then over these past months, we wouldn't have had sensible measures like asking people to wear face coverings. We wouldn't have had other mitigations in our schools, for example. We wouldn't have advised people sensibly to work from home. And we wouldn't, therefore, be in the stronger position that we're in right now, able to lift these protective measures from Monday of next week. So, given that Douglas Ross has called it wrong, literally at every juncture of this pandemic, forgive me if I'm not going to start listening to him now. In terms of business support, of course, much of the and incidentally, on the issue of opposition politicians and quoting people, Douglas Ross opened his line of questioning today, misrepresenting, in my view, Pete Wishart, and then he takes issue with the fact that I give a direct quote from Sandesh Gohani. And let me repeat that direct quote. At the moment, this cautious approach is the one that we should be taking. On the issue of business support, of course, much of this business support will not be available to businesses suffering the same impact south of the border. All local authorities, if Douglas Ross doesn't think they're suffering the same impact, then I suggest he really needs to get out a little bit more. All local authorities have started processing payments. Some local authorities have made very good progress and say that they've already paid almost all of the hospitality and leisure businesses eligible for support. All local authorities are on track to complete 100% of payments to hospitality and leisure businesses affected by the Christmas cancellations and physical distancing by the 31st of January. So that support available here that is not available elsewhere, and we will continue to do the right thing by businesses.
Douglas Ross.
The First Minister needs to make her mind up. She's accusing the Conservatives of opposing every measure she puts forward, and then, in the same breath, she's accusing the Conservatives for wanting a cautious approach. It is simply not opportunistic to trust the people in Scotland, to trust that they can learn to live with COVID rather than having to live with her government's restrictions, which are having a massive impact on jobs, on businesses and communities across Scotland, and they're not getting the money or the support that they were promised. And the First Minister has got the big decisions wrong over the last few months. Too quick to bring in unnecessary COVID restrictions, too late to launch mass vaccination centres, too late to change the self-isolation rules, too late to get funding to businesses who need it. The First Minister says she doesn't shy away from mistakes she's made in the handling of this pandemic. So can't she finally just admit that by introducing these tough restrictions here in Scotland before Christmas, and by wanting to introduce even tougher restrictions, she simply made the wrong call?
First Minister.
Well, I'll let the people of Scotland judge the impact of the calls I and my government have made. But let me say this. Right now, on first doses, on second doses, on third doses, on booster vaccination doses, Scotland is the most vaccinated part of the United Kingdom. So, Presiding Officer, if Douglas Ross's proposition is that we left it too late, then what on earth does that say about his own colleagues in the Westminster Government? We also, in terms of the ONS figures this week, infection levels in England right now are over 20% higher than in Scotland. I don't think it's a competition, but if Douglas Ross wants to make these comparisons, then they are the comparisons. There is the data. But can I say gently to Douglas Ross, because I know he's having a tough time politically, but can I say gently, it is inconsistent, entirely inconsistent. There is no consistency in saying, as his health spokesperson did, that the cautious approach is the one that we should be taking, and then opposing every cautious measure that we choose to take for opportunistic reasons. So can I suggest that Douglas Ross just gets his own house in order, perhaps suggest to more of his colleagues that they obey the rules that are in place when they are in place, and leaves this government to get on with steering this country responsibly and in a mature, grown-up fashion through the global pandemic?